Welcome to Around the Empire, a show that takes you around the U.S. empire. I'm your host, Dan Wright.
And I'm your host, Joanne Leon.
And on today's show, October 24th, 2017, we're going to talk about the incident in Niger and the larger scramble for Africa. So for those who are unaware, a recent ambush in the African country of Niger, that is Niger, not Nigeria, 4 total so far that we know of U.S. special forces were killed in an ambush, and which sparked a, media story based on whether or not President Trump was sufficiently gracious in calling the widow of one of the killed soldiers, which led to a whole, mini Euripides play about this valor of soldiers and accusations and counter-accusations. But what's actually interesting, and probably interesting for the people who listen to this show, is the U.S. has forces in Niger. And according to a report that I read, Lindsey Graham, among other senators, have said they had no idea that U.S. forces were in yet another country.
Which I don't believe for a minute.
Which, begs the question, why is the U.S. even in Africa? And makes me think of a story actually that came out today by Nick Turse. It's over at Vice. And it says, U.S. troops are now conducting 3,500 exercises, programs, and engagements per year, average of nearly 10 missions per day on the African continent, according to the U.S. military's top commander for Africa, General Thomas Waldhauser. The latest numbers, which the Pentagon confirmed to Vice News, represent a dramatic increase in U.S. military activity throughout Africa in the past decade, and the latest signal of America's deepening and complicated ties on the continent, with the White House and the Pentagon facing questions about an October 4th ambush in Niger, in which 4 U.S. Special Forces soldiers were killed. Secretary of Defense James Mattis reportedly indicated to 2 senior members of the Senate Armed Services Committee Friday that these numbers are only likely to increase as the U.S. military shifts even greater attention to, quote, counterterrorism in Africa. So, Joanne, yet another theater of battle, and I'm forced to wonder what possible interests for the average American person, or really even the country, are in Niger. And yet another war. Justified by what? I'm not sure. I mean, no one's asking what is the actual rationalization. Is this under the AUMF of 2001?
Well, what's interesting is that some journalists and other people are questioning. I was actually more surprised that they were questioning why we were there, and in some cases feigning surprise that we were there. Because if Nick Turse could figure this out 2 years ago, and if AFRICOM split off and was built out since 2008, I don't think it's surprising at all. At least I wasn't surprised. And all the political kerfuffle has actually caused us to maybe get a little more information about the whole thing than we normally would have. And I think, because Trump is now president, we're going to get a little bit more, what do you want to call it? Adversarial journalism, just a little bit more questioning of what's going on. For instance, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Dunford, did a press conference, which is kind of unusual, and spent quite a long time, told the journalists, hey, you don't have to fight over asking questions because I'm going to stay here until you're finished. Anyway, I can just play that clip just so for people who didn't hear about it. It's a long press conference. I personally think it's worth listening to, but let's just catch what he calls the timeline, because there have been bits that have changed, which is, to be expected. And there's an investigation, so he doesn't answer a lot of questions about a lot of the details, but he gives us a broad framework. And let's just play that.
Approximately 800 service members in Niger work as part of an international effort led by 4,000 French troops to defeat terrorists in West Africa. Since 2011, French and U.S. troops have trained a 5,000-person West African force and over 35,000 soldiers from the region to fight terrorists and affiliated with ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and Boko Haram. Now, let me address the specific events in Niger that took place early this month. On the 3rd of October, 12 members of the U.S. Special Operations Task Force accompanied 30 Nigerian forces on a civil military reconnaissance mission from the capital city of Niamey to an area near the village of Tongo Tongo. Approximately 85 kilometers to the north was the location of that village. On the 4th of October, U.S. and Nigerian forces began moving back south. And en route to their operating base, the patrol came under attack from approximately 50 enemy using small arms fire, rocket-propelled grenades, and technical vehicles. And what I want to do now is I want to walk through for you the timeline that we have and kind of what I would categorize as what we know about the incident. So early in the morning of 3rd October, as I mentioned, U.S. forces accompanied that Nigerian unit on a reconnaissance mission to gather information. The assessment by our leaders on the ground at that time was that contact with the enemy was unlikely. Mid-morning on October 4th, the patrol began to take fire as they were returning to their operating base. Approximately 1 hour after taking fire, the team requested support. And within minutes, a remotely piloted aircraft arrived overhead. Within an hour, French Mirage jets arrived on station. And then later that afternoon, French attack helicopters arrived on station, and a Nigerian quick reaction force arrived in the area where our troops were in contact with the enemy. During a firefight, 2 U.S. soldiers were wounded and evacuated by French air to Niamey, and that was consistent with the casualty evacuation plan that was in place for this particular operation. 3 U.S. soldiers who were killed in action were evacuated on the evening of 4 October, and at that time, Sergeant LaDavid Johnson was still missing. On the evening of 6 October, Sergeant Johnson's body was found and subsequently evacuated. From the time the firefight was initiated until Sergeant Johnson's body was recovered, French, Nigerian, or U.S. forces remained in that area. Now, many of you have asked a number of questions, and those are all, and many of them are fair questions, and we owe you more information. More importantly, we owe the families that have fallen more information, and that's what the investigation is designed to identify. The questions include, did the mission of U.S. forces change during the operation? Did our forces have adequate intelligence, equipment, and training? Was our pre-mission assessment of the threat in the area accurate? How did U.S. forces become separated during the engagement, specifically Sergeant Johnson? And why did it take time to find and recover Sergeant Johnson? Again, these are all fair questions that the investigation is designed to identify. And what I would say is I hope from this brief overview I've outlined why our forces were in Niger, what they were doing at the time of the incident on the 3rd and 4th of October, what we know, and again, the questions that remain that we will work on over the next several weeks as the investigation unfolds.
What I also did, because my sense was that we are in Africa for the same reason that we're in other countries and on other continents. It's mostly for the resources and the domination of the governments there to set up a situation where we have a friendly government in place who allows our corporations to come in, take their resources, and we give a few people, like the leaders of these countries, a lot of money and a lot of leeway, and maybe a 1%, create a 1% there who benefits, and the rest of the country pretty much screwed. And this is, it gets more complicated, though, because not only is it our usual imperial strategy, but we also have China very, very active in Africa. And I don't know about you, Dan, but I think it's kind of impossible to deny that we've got a Cold War going on right now with China. Even if we can't step into the places where they are, we want to deny them from, the two enemies, really, China and Russia. I don't hear very much about Russia in Africa, but we hear a lot about China, and they seem to be pretty successful because they're doing a lot of investment. They're building infrastructure and so on. So I don't really think it's a whole lot about terrorism, but
even if it was terrorism like Boko Haram, who cares? that's not even remotely an American problem, although I'm sure they'd love to stoke these people into doing something anti-American to justify their presence. But look, I mean, there's an article here. The country with the second most U.S. military personnel deployed is Niger, with roughly 800, according to AFRICOM. So who knows what the numbers really are. Next comes Somalia, Djibouti's neighbor. Obviously, Djibouti, there's Camp Lemonnier, the only permanent U.S. base in Africa. By the way, yes, the U.S. does have a permanent base in Africa. It's in Djibouti. The second most deployed area is Niger, with AFRICOM confirming 800 U.S. military personnel. Next, Somalia, with roughly 400. And then the fourth is Cameroon, with more than 100. So the U.S. does have some military presence in virtually every African nation, even if it's small. Right. Most nations, according to June figures from the Pentagon, have at least a handful of active duty personnel temporarily deployed there. Now, Marine Corps General Thomas D. Waldhauser, commander of U.S. African Command, called Africa a, quote, enduring interest, unquote, for the U.S. Quote, Africa is an enduring interest for the United States, General Waldhauser said. He said in a statement provided by AFRICOM, quote, small but wise investments in the capability, legitimacy, and accountability of African defense institutions offer disproportionate benefits to Africa, our allies, and the United States, and importantly, enable African solutions to African problems, unquote.
Yeah.
This is the most ridiculous. I mean, our presence allows African solutions to African problems. I mean, this is Orwellian to a stupid degree, but it's not even Orwellian. The fact of the matter is a lot of this is racist openly, who said that we're there to help, it may have been Mattis, we're there to help Africans teach them about human rights, which was the quote.
Oh my God.
Yeah, and I mean, this is white man's burden on crack now, and this is all, I agree. This is about this Cold War between China, which I think, by the way, is going to bite China in the ass pretty hard. China has made a lot of purchases in Africa. It's loaned the leaders there a lot of money all over the continent to secure resources for what China hopes will become a kind of transitioning to a consumer-based economy. They want all these, they want the sort of the finer things. They want access to resources, which for a growing economy. Of course, they're going to find the problem that a lot of people have found, which is they're going to have a difficulty, keeping people honest. That's the problem with corruption, is people, take advantage, which means China ultimately, to collect on its debts, to collect on those contracts, is going to have to send troops in. So I'm sure in the future you're going to see, Chinese troops in Africa, because they're going to have to, how are they going to get paid back? The contracts are meaningless. But the question for the U.S. is, why do we care about that problem? Why do we care about China expanding in Africa? Why are we making a claim on these assets, or rather these resources? This isn't traditionally, remember, AFRICOM, as Joanne noted, is new. This was not typically, this was the European powers played these little games in Africa, much to the detriment of the Africans. Obviously Congo with King Leopold, who treated it like his own personal fiefdom and, brutalized the people there to the point where there was anti-colonial movements. Obviously South Africa happened, which is a legacy of white colonialism. But the United States, outside of the Cold War context, where they did help overthrow Lumumba in Congo and other places, why are we getting involved here, let alone in these smaller nations that have no serious, we just don't have real interests here. And I think the claim that this is, an enduring interest, as the general said, I know how you justify that. And here it is, the quote, by the way, I have John Kelly. This is from CNN, John Kelly answering a question as to why U.S. Special Forces are in Niger. We are in Africa, quote, to teach them how to respect human rights, unquote. So that's
just insane. I can't believe he said that.
That is the chief of staff to President Trump. And talk about, entangling alliances and, endless wars. There's no end. That's the other thing. These people are literally looking they're trying to involve the U.S. in things that we have no business in. This to me is Vietnam on steroids. There's really no interest here for the U.S. and they're just throwing us into this. And of course, then Americans get killed and we have to avenge these brave young men who got killed. And then you just get further and further into the abyss. But that's what these people want. And some of them, by the way, like General Kelly, may actually believe their own bullshit and think this is about a civilizing mission. I mean, it is so white man's burden. It's painful.
It's interesting that you bring up Vietnam, because today, as I was listening to different interviews and reading things, I thought, this feels so much like Vietnam. And it's even a French colonial situation, too, that France is having trouble, I don't exactly know what France is doing. I mean, I guess technically, these countries were decolonized, but France, within the past decade, just seems to want to reassert their imaginary empire again. I really don't understand. Although there was an interview on Democracy Now! And they had two guests, and they were particularly interesting, very, very opinionated. And maybe I wouldn't go all the way as far as they took their points, but just very insightful things. And one was a man named Horace Campbell, who's right now living and working in West Africa. He's there for a year at a university in Ghana, at an institute there. I think it said he's a prophet at Syracuse University, but he's very outspoken. And the other one was his name, I think I'm going to botch this name, unfortunately, because it's Mark Fancher, I think it is, Fancher. And he's he's a lawyer and a contributor to Black Agenda Report, which is very good for people who don't know that blog. It's a really good site for a lot of reasons, but especially for their coverage of Africa. I do remember during Libya finding points of view there that I couldn't find anywhere else. He wrote an article about this, and he said AFRICOM's chickens come home to roost. I mean, that's the kind of, he feels and both of them feel it's a duplicitous mission in Africa, not only for some of the reasons I talked about, but, talking about creating a better life for people in Africa.
Oh, give me a break.
When the way African Americans are treated here, I mean, it's just amazing that they
have no interest in. I mean, this is such a stupid argument. The Pentagon has an interest.
No, it's the same one they use every time, and it's really worn out.
There's enough dupes in this country for it to work. That's the sad part.
I think that, to be honest, Americans at this point would be more receptive to a more honest argument of, about the rise of China and how we need to try to keep that in check. I'm not saying that I agree with that, but I think that Americans would be more receptive to that argument than this constant, spreading freedom and democracy and fighting terrorism. I mean, they're really going back to let's fight them over there so that we don't have to fight them over here. I mean,
fight who? That's just counterterrorism. The counterterrorism mission is the biggest bullshit of this all. These groups are there.
One really big point, though. The war with ISIS in the Middle East was supposed to be, remember, it was supposed to take like 30 years. When we went back into Iraq, Petraeus and other military brass were telling us that this is going to be a long fight. No. And now, the Russians messed that up. And Trump wants to take credit for defeating ISIS. So they're like, well, what do we do now? We're not going home. We need to leave a lot of troops deployed. So Lindsey Graham he was the bellwether there. I don't know if you saw what he said, but he said, the war's moving to Africa.
Because the war is now morphing, it's going to places that we haven't heard of before, to the American people. We're going to follow the terrorists wherever they go. We're going to use whatever means we need to with partners to destroy them, and whatever time it takes, and most people are not ready for that, but I am. I am so sorry these 4 men died in operations, but I will say this about the operations, and I can't give you the details. They died in the defense of America. this war is getting hot in places where it's been cool. And we got to go where the enemy takes us.
I mean, he's jumping right on board with.
Of
hey,
course, because this is a business. This is fundamentally the Pentagon just want more war. This is their job. They want to expand the markets. They want to. I mean, it's like if they didn't do this, they'd have these. They have all this equipment. They have all this money. They have to justify their budget. I think people who don't understand DC don't understand that agencies are measured. Their power is by how big their budget is, and so you always have to spend the money. You have to find a way to spend money. You have to find a way to increase your budget. The Pentagon is pretty good at that. Evidence being they have roughly $1 trillion budget each year. It's like 660 or something on the books, but they count in the ancillary costs. So they need to keep expanding. It's grow or die. That's why they're there. They don't human rights. They couldn't give it less. They couldn't care less if they tried. The issue for the strategists is, I guess they want to box in China, but then you have to turn back and say, well, what the hell does the average American have any interest in any of this? And the answer is there is none. There is no interest. There is zero things that will make anyone's life in this country better at all involved in AFRICOM. It is really, it's Afghanistan. We talked with Scott Horton in a previous episode about Afghanistan. It's just a machine that keeps eating and eating. That is what they want AFRICOM to be. They want to have some excuse to get here. And they're still, by the way, some of them are still pissed off about Somalia in the 90s when they think Clinton cut and run after the Mogadishu incident, famously immortalized in the movie Black Hawk Down. We got chased out of Somalia. We got chased out. So there's all sorts of mixtures here, but there's no one asking. And this is saying, why do we care about this? Why is this important? Why are we underfunding all of our domestic issues to continually expand a imperial force in a continent that we have in an area? Forget just the continent itself, just even the areas that we're focused on. There's no discernible value. And of course, our involvement never decreases the terrorism. It's only increased. Al-Qaeda in North Africa is thriving with our interventions. ISIS is thriving after Libya. Yes, we've killed a lot of ISIS in Syria and Iraq, but is the Sunni jihadism over?
Well, Al-Qaeda is thriving. I wouldn't say that ISIS is thriving, but Al-Qaeda.
That brand is down.
Yeah,
Al-Qaeda's having a comeback.
Yeah, and they're, still talking about, the threat, the great threat, Al-Qaeda threat to us. But they just leave out the bit about, backing them in Syria or when it becomes convenient. And I think the war on terror narrative is completely falling apart, but you'd never know it from listening to the brass and the media and the journalists in that room in the Pentagon press conference.
Oh, they're terrible.
Well, some of them are actually standing up. Well, are you sure those are Green Berets in Niger? Do they have everything they need? Do they
have more equipment?
They're leading right into it. Aren't you? Don't you think we better give them more stuff? And we they just increased the already outrageous defense budget by another $50 billion, I think more than anybody had really asked for.
Oh, they give the Pentagon stuff they don't even want. Remember those M1 Abrams? I mean, they just keep giving them these tanks. The Pentagon says, we don't need any more tanks. Please stop giving them. That is why, not to go back to this point over and over again on this podcast, but Eisenhower's original draft was the military-industrial congressional complex. Because Congress are collaborators. They're supposed to be holding people in check, and they're supposed to be doing oversight. Like, oh, why do we have U.S. forces in Africa? Who authorized that? Isn't Congress supposed to be in charge of war? I mean, I know it's a quaint notion under the imperial presidency, but actually, under the Constitution, only Congress has the power to declare a war. But, they're supposed to be doing oversight. But instead of doing oversight, they're business agents for Boeing and Lockheed and all these other companies, and they just want things built, and they couldn't be more happy. I mean, where's the oversight? The Saudi, let's just say, let's take a neutral stance on the Saudi arms deal that happened, that Trump parroted, right? Or trumpeted, I should say. That is one of the largest arms deals in recent years, maybe in American history. has there been any hearings or oversight on that arms deal? And the answer is no. And why would there be no hearings on that arms deal? Because everybody's for it. There's no opposition to defense spending.
No, there's not. It's really, you have to give them credit. It's a very cleverly designed system.
Survived the Cold War.
They spread, I think, the F-35, a disastrous program of all-purpose or multi-role fighter jet. I think every single congressional district has a piece of that. I think they're involved, even if somebody's just providing nuts and bolts. It's technically jobs for...
Well, that was the B-52 too, right? Every state made a piece of the B-52.
Yeah, I mean,
because they wanted every...
You got to hand it to them, Dan. That is some smart strategizing. And
political, they call it in Pentagon political engineering.
Do they?
Yeah, that's the term for it, political engineering.
Yeah.
There's actually a good documentary on it. It's called Why We Fight. I don't know if you saw it. I'd highly recommend it. It was by one of the filmmakers behind the trial of Henry Kissinger. I want to say Eugene Jarecki, but that might be the wrong name. They have a Air Force colonel woman who's a part of it, and she says that's what they call it.
Right, probably.
They call it political engineering.
Okay.
And I think they've mastered it. They're masters. And so, but here's the point. But this actually plays directly into AFRICOM. So why are we in Africa? Why are we expanding this thing? We don't have any real interest. It's because the system's got to eat. It's got to expand. It can't just stay where there's already 700 military bases, but it needs to expand each year to justify this budget and to bring jobs home. I mean, they all say they're free market capitalists, but when it comes, Chalmers Johnson, the late great Chalmers Johnson, had a term he called military Keynesianism, which was that all these right-wing Republicans and, of course, the Democrats and liberals, when it came to the military, it was stimulative. They were willing to spend stimulative money, military Keynesianism. So I think that's AFRICOM. That's that's why I think we're still there. I mean, I cannot find, I challenge you or anyone else to find a legitimate national security interest in Niger.
Well, you're looking at it from the wrong point of view. You have to put yourself in the shoes of the 1% and the corporations. Horace Campbell sort of laid it out sort of briefly. He said, it's not just Niger. He said, since 2007, the U.S. expanded their reach with embassy-based operations, centers using African, local armies, and drones. And the reason why AFRICOM was expanded, like in a major way, happened that when oil operations were disrupted in the Niger Delta, and I guess elsewhere too, like there was a pipeline that got either blown up or messed with, and there were kidnapping, oil company employees and things like that. And then, suddenly we decided that AFRICOM had to be built out. And of course, there's always sort of synchronicity of motive and benefit because, it's never hard to get, as we said, to get Congress to go along with some more wars because of what we just talked about. And then also we have...
Okay, what does Niger have? I know Nigeria, and maybe this is a good time to consult a map.
There are multiple countries that have oil resources, but there's also... Niger has uranium, a lot of it. And Campbell also brought up some emails that came out, Hillary's emails. And they talk about, because we really have to bring France into this. This is not just us. Some of the Hillary emails talked about Sarkozy and his views that a Pan-African movement had to be defeated because it would devalue the French currency. He said that of course, France has been accused of funding and backing jihadis, which we know actually happened to overturn Libya. That was sort of the beginning of it. But he said that he mobilized those forces to save Europe.
Yeah, I mean, we should talk maybe for a second. I think we've talked about this before, but France is an utterly irresponsible, moronic nation on the national stage. I'm sure domestically there's friends with a lot of French people. I know some friends, I think they're great people. But as a national government, their foreign policy behavior, it is moronic. They don't know what they're doing. They're this sort of third-rate power who's constantly has some kind of, dare I say, Napoleon complex, and is constantly trying to demonstrate that it's such like a kind of like insecurity or something. And so they end up blundering into the most stupid things all over the world, particularly in Africa. Sarkozy, who was the president of France at the time, or the leader of France at the time, sent jets before they were even negotiating with Libya. He sent French planes in. I mean, like they're involved in all these. Their intelligence service is a complete disaster. They actually ended up, I remember, under the socialist leader Mitterrand, bombing Greenpeace. If you can believe it, they actually put a bomb on a Greenpeace boat. I mean, these people are like completely, and their recent behavior in Africa is amazing. So we talk a lot about the U.S. empire, and that's what we focus on, not just because we're Americans, but because it's by far the most, it's easily the largest and certainly the most influential. But there are still these little like European states, France chief among them, who are blundering around doing incredibly stupid things around the world and causing a ton of problems. So, anytime you see France involved, I just wait for something stupid to happen, because they really don't know what they're doing, and they have this need to feel relevant to the point of just the most reckless stuff. So I would not be surprised if France was involved in a lot of this stuff. They consider, even though these places have thrown off the colonial governments, I mean, France had a lot of colonies. There's constant tensions in the Ivory Coast. There's constant tensions in Le Monde Francophone, which is the French world. They're constantly involved. The French Foreign Legion, the other thing. So I'm sure that speaking of Vietnam, I'm sure that we're taking some of our cues once again from French colonial projects. But I can only hope that we temper ourselves, because their track record, lately and previously, is a nightmare.
Well, another thing that Campbell said, and I'll add some audio clips in here because I'm probably not doing the guy justice, but he said that, since 2007, we've expanded the reach via AFRICOM. He also mentioned that, first of all, Niger produces uranium, which is a big part of France's energy supply. Energy is always a huge issue in Europe. But in 2010, the president of Niger accused France of financing terror, and then he was overthrown by a coup. So here's a clip by Horace Campbell on Democracy Now!
The United States is in a dubious alliance with France that wants to instigate ideas about terror in order to save capitalism in France. So this relationship between the United States and France in what is called fighting war and terror in the Sahel comes 6 years after the United States, France, and Britain went into Libya to destroy that country, because that country wanted to create the basis for the unification of Africa and an African currency. Last year, President Obama said that going into Libya was the biggest mistake of his presidency. Later, in October of 2016, the British Parliament had a report that said that going into Libya was based on lies. The only government that did not respond was the French government that mobilized those who are called Al-Qaeda to fight against Gaddafi. The same French government that mobilized the so-called Al-Qaeda forces in the Mali, in Niger, is mobilizing within the United Nations to get African Union, to get 5 countries in Africa, Mauritania, Mali, Chad, Burkina Faso, and Niger, to support France to get the United Nations to send millions of dollars in this so-called fight against terrorism.
You say in order to understand what's happening in Niger, we have to understand what has happened in Libya. Can you take us down that path?
Thank you, Amy. As you know, I wrote a book called Global NATO and the Catastrophic Failure in Libya, Lessons for Africa in the Forging of African Unity. We now know, as was said on this program, that Sarkozy of France said that France went into Libya to save the euro. There are 14 African countries who cannot have independent monetary and fiscal policy because their currency is tied to the euro through France. Now, France mobilized jihadists, those who are called terrorists, especially from among the Tuareg, in Libya to fight. France mobilized jihadists to overthrow Gaddafi. Those same jihadists were guided to Mali to overthrow the people and to disrupt the situation in Mali. The same France that mobilized the jihadists then went to the United Nations in 2013 to get the United Nations Security Council to support France to fight against terrorism. This is duplicity. The same thing is happening with Chad. Chad had 4,000 troops fighting in Libya. Chad is part of this 5-nation plus one that is working with France to destabilize West Africa and the Sahel. Now, the United States has recently placed the government of Chad on the list of countries that have a Muslim ban. And the United States call the government of Chad duplicitous. It is the same government of France and Chad and the United States of America that is working to undermine efforts of the African Union to bring peace and reconstruction and the African currency to Africa.
And so you really can't isolate Niger either, because you have Mali, Chad, Libya. There was talk of a drone base. I think we have 8 bases, which are probably small. Like Rumsfeld's plan was to create what he called lily pad bases, small bases like everywhere, and especially throughout Africa. A lot of it, the root of sort of the current crisis goes back to Libya. And he says that, Libya was based on lies, that the French government mobilized al-Qaeda against Gaddafi and is now mobilizing to get the African Union, which is 5 countries, to support France and spend millions in this so-called fight against terrorism. And he argues, very vehemently that what Africans need is reconstruction. And it makes no sense for the U.S. to build a $100 million base in Niger when France has a base there already. There is no war on terror. They financed the terrorists is what. So, it's starting to sound very similar to Syria and other places.
It sounds similar to what the British were pulling when they had this guy in Manchester who does the bombing of the Ariana Grande concert, and his father and that, by the way, that's absolutely true. France has a very deep connection to Islamic Jihad and jihadists. They fund them, they sponsor them, they consider it. It's one thing, and it goes back to this egotistical thing. It makes them feel relevant, so they get in bed with terrorists. It's one of the reasons, by the way. There was a lot of people in France who deserve to be applauded for opposing the Iraq War. That's not why their leadership opposed it. Their leadership opposed it because they were part of a bribe scheme. But so the French elite are corrupt. They're on the take. They're taking money from jihadists and their sponsors, the Saudis in particular. They are not, yes, the people of France, they responded to public pressure to not enter to Iraq. The people of France should be applauded. The people of England, or rather the Great Britain, also opposed it, but the government did it anyway. But that's not why the French leadership did it. They're extremely corrupt people, and they were corrupted by that money, but they have a corrupt alliance with jihadists and the Middle East powers, and so they're in bed with jihadism. That's been proven, I think, continually. France is just not, and like I said, it's part of its corruption and money, and part of it's like, well, no, we matter because we have these alliances with powerful people. And of course, just like in England, or rather Manchester, when they have these alliance with these Libyan exiles who end up bombing a concert. France has this open door policy with jihadists, and ISIS comes in and does the attack, was the Bataclan attack or whatever it was called, in Paris. And it's an open door, and people say, well, why isn't there any pressure on to stop these terrorist attacks? And the answer is because it's an open door. They work with these people all the time.
It's a cost of doing business,
It's a cost of doing business. They want to have influence in the Middle East. They get in bed with various actors, just like the British did with this guy who was living in Manchester. His father was a terrorist. He's a terrorist. They knew he came back from Syria and Libya after going in to help overthrow Gaddafi. Oh, well, but we want to have influence and power in the region, so we're going to have these dark alliances. And of course, as always, it blows up in their face. And the people who suffer aren't the elite who made the alliances. It's the average person who's just going to a concert either in Paris or Manchester. There
are some other things that I wasn't aware of that I came across in these interviews that I watched. I believe this was the Real News interview on the Real News. All of these things I will link in the show notes, and I'll add some audio clips if it makes sense to do that. I'm definitely going to wreck this name, but it's Leonce Ndikumana, Ndikumana. He asserts the same sort of Pan-African view, just pro-African view, that people from African countries need to reap the benefits of their own resources, and they don't. And this is a long, how many centuries has this been the case? But here's an interesting detail that he adds to it.
So talk about why you use the term the war on offshore finance.
We use the term the war against offshore finance because contrary to what the popular perception that Africa has no resources, is indebted to the rest of the world, we actually find that the facts show that Africa generates massive amounts of resources from its natural resources, from public government, from government revenue, and it receives a substantial amount of external financing, external debt, ODA. But we also find that a massive amount of funds leaks out of the continent and ends up financing private wealth in the offshore financial centers. And offshore financial centers are places where money is invested in banks, real estate, other physical assets outside of the site of the regulatory authorities in originating countries, that is African countries. So that is money that gets sent to these banks and other centers without being recorded in government official statistics. That money will never pay taxes and will not benefit the African countries at all. And these are centers which thrive on this banking secrecy tradition, where money comes in, not reported to the originating countries, and the banks are basically colluding with corrupt leaders and corrupt private investors who send this money for the purpose of, first of all, avoiding scrutiny on the origin of the money, how the money was acquired, how the money was transferred, and also to evade taxation on the income that's going to be generated from that money stashed in these offshore centers. These offshore centers are actually, the number of those offshore centers is expanding. The importance is expanding. The volume of money that they handle is expanding. We estimate that from African countries, sub-Saharan African countries, as much as 700 billion have leaked out of the continent over the past 4 decades. If you consider that this money has earned interest, the stock of flight capital, it reaches about $1 trillion over the past decade.
So the way this works is we find a friendly government, or we overthrow and then install a friendly government. And we make the leaders and the elite of that country very, very, very wealthy. But what he brings up, he says that the funds actually leave the continent and the finances end up in offshore financial centers with no transparency. We sort of help them hide the loot. And as it turns out, the three primary places where this money ends up is London, New York, and Paris. And they basically help the leaders of these kleptocracies to hide the money. And he's saying these are Western countries that have clear rules about things, and they're not even enforcing their own rules. I mean, the corruption, there's always going to be corruption. I realize that. I'm not an idealist. I'm a little bit, but I'm not naive. I realize that you can't kill corruption, but you can keep it to I might say tolerable level, or not totally disruptive level where you end up undermining yourself. So it's actually the banks that are benefiting from this too. And a lot of people have been talking about the capital flight from Africa, and I wasn't sure exactly what they were talking about, but that's another point. And here's another bit from a different interview. This interview was with a woman named Amira Woods. It's back in 2013, so it seems like the conditions are still pretty much the same as they were in, say, 10 years ago, but it's just grown and grown and grown. So it's probably even more of a problem now. But what she says that, as we all know, there's a growing Chinese presence on the continent. But this I didn't know. Africa has 6 of the top 10 growth economies in the world. And that U.S. activity in Africa is, it's about the resources, as it always has been, but it's about countering China and the growing economies. But the only thing we tend to offer is the security, the defense type products and services, whereas China has taken a different approach. They're building infrastructure. We know they're building. We're seeing the fruits of some of that now with railways that are now completed, and it's actually improving the economies. It allows the little guy to benefit from this engagement with a foreign power and foreign investment. Whereas this isn't just the U.S., right? This is the U.S., the U.K., France. This is NATO. With NATO investment, you tend to get more guns and military bases and train your soldiers and all that. But China's, as Pepe Escobar meant, China goes with their win-win strategy. Here's a clip of Amira Woods on The Real News in 2013.
Well, I think for a while now, many of us as African analysts had said that the U.S. interests in Africa are because of access to oil and other key resources, the so-called war on terror, and also countering China. So I do think that becomes a key determinant in U.S. policy at this time. Some people call it the cool war between China and the U.S. that's ongoing now. But I think clearly, when you see the rise of Africa, Africa has 6 of the top 10 growing economies in the world. I think it is incumbent upon the U.S. to engage more strategically, regardless of what happens with China, to engage in areas that move beyond, particularly the security sector and the extractive industries, that help to create an environment where the enormous growth of Africa is coupled with a certain attention to inequality that is still also very ripe on the continent. So what China has been doing, essentially, yes, there are issues on labor rights concerns, on environmental damage for both China and U.S. investors, but China has also gone a long way towards infrastructure development on the continent, building roads, building hospitals, building stadiums even. The experience of China is completely different when you look back over the last decade and compare it to the U.S., that has, as we've said, been much more focused on the security sector, on not involving itself in infrastructure development. I think it is important to use the trip as an opportunity to see some of the good that is done. When infrastructure is built that can help to improve economies in the interests of those, particularly in areas where key resources lie. It is important for those who are on the land where the resources lie to actually benefit. That the resources of Africa, in the beautiful words of our liberation leader, from back in the 60s, Patrice Lumumba, who said the resources of Africa must feed the children of Africa. I think there is a critical moment in history now to revisit that old adage from Lumumba and to ensure that the benefits of Africa's dramatic economic rise actually meet the interests of all of Africa's people.
Not that I think that China is a benevolent.
China, let's be clear, China is absolutely not a benevolent power. And like I said, they will send troops into Africa in the next few years and engage in probably some horrible crimes, because they have set themselves up to have to do it because they've made all these business deals, and they're going to run into these corrupt governments aren't going to honor the deal, or they're going to say, well, our people need the food, not you, or, oh, I'm sorry, we're broke, we ran a budget, or oops, the foreign minister stole all the money, we have a huge deficit, and China's going to have to go in to collect. So as China's not even benevolent power now, in years to come, it's going to be even less benevolent. It's going to be sending troops in. I think China has a better strategy than the U.S. does, because it's not so. The U.S. is such a absolutist position because we're in charge. We need a global canopy. We need to control everything. But China is absolutely going to. The years to come, as China gets more powerful, you're going to see some horrible things.
It's a very similar strategy that the former United States used to use with the Marshall Plan, for example. Yeah. It's before our empire became completely financialized, or whatever they call that. Right now, nothing happens unless the banks make out on it, and we got too big and powerful, and we forgot that. And we've decided that we can put down any resistance. And, we and our friends are willing to use some of the most vicious players to do that. But the mind-blowing thing is that then we use those same monsters who we employed to justify bringing our military in. It's like I've always heard about Henry Kissinger's dual-track policy, and I assume that's similar to what we're seeing now, but I tell you, it's just, I know they do it, I've seen it multiple times, but it's still a mind blower. And the thing is, I don't think the world believes it anymore. And I think Syria,
only the U.S. press, only the U.S. press.
I think Syria that's where the curtain got pulled back. In Syria, I think it was, what we did in Syria is a mistake for so many reasons. But that's one of them. It really just it pulled the curtain back.
What if you were an MSNBC watcher, or you read the New York Times as absolutely horrible coverage, or Washington Post? Did the curtain get pulled back for you? Because I don't see anyone doing a mea culpa. It's just like Iraq, they couldn't avoid it. But do you see anybody coming out and saying, man, backing the rebels, the quote-unquote rebels in Syria, was a really stupid thing? In fact, I see them saying, if only we had intervened sooner.
I don't remember the specific newspapers or the articles, but there were a few that admitted this. But no, you're right. But I wonder what percentage of the population gets their news from MSNBC and CNN now?
Too many.
Shrinking, right? I don't know exactly how many people realize that we were backing the wrong side, or definitely not backing not good guys. But I think a significant amount of people now realize who didn't before. So that's about as far as I'm willing to stick my neck out. But yeah, so what else did I find? Another tidbit. I also watched a short interview with Cynthia McKinney. I know she's a controversial figure, but she's solid on foreign policy toward African countries, and she's had those positions for a long time. I think she's a solid source for that. You know, she says we still have these cold warriors on U.S. foreign policy, and you know, one of the big objectives is to deny resources or any kind of, you know, gains to the two big enemies, China and Russia. They still view the world as a chessboard. And another little bit, maybe this other people knew that, I didn't know this, but she said that Gaddafi's wife, she takes everything back to Libya as well as a good reference point. She said that Gaddafi's wife said that Gaddafi had denied AFRICOM permission to build a base in Libya. And that's what ended up, I don't know, that was a catalyst, which I hadn't heard that before.
I don't know if I buy that.
But she also makes a pretty interesting argument, because why has this been so secret? Like, why are senators saying that they don't even know what happened? And frankly, unless you read Nick Turse and maybe, you know, or read Black Agenda Report or a few others, probably most people didn't have any idea that we had any, certainly not to the extent that we had. Like,
I know, but these are senators on the Armed Service Committee. Aren't they supposed to know at least?
You would think. Well,
if they don't know.
Mostly special operations, right? So.
Oh, so they don't have to be informed because it's special. That's an easy game to play.
But the expansion of AFRICOM happened. I'm not saying that President Obama began or made that decision, but it turns out that at the same time that we elected the first African American president, whose father is from Kenya,
it's like Afghanistan.
it was already in motion when he came.
It was in motion when he got there, and it takes on its own momentum because it's a beast. It just keeps eating and eating. And now the funny thing is, you'd think, oh, we got some people killed. That's going to be terrible for AFRICOM, but you'd be wrong, because actually having dead American soldiers is good for AFRICOM's agenda, because it means, how we need more forces there to protect. We can't have these limited patrols anymore. We need to have overwhelming force if we're going to send people in. We need more drone bases to make sure we don't have to send people out. It's Vietnam all over again. It's we're just sending in advisors. No. Well, advisors aren't enough. We need special operations to protect the air bases. Oh, the air bases are just cover for the South Vietnamese army. Oh, well, we can't protect the air bases without the Marines. Oh, so we better send in the Marines. Like, it's a total, this is what they want. It's a slow ramp up. And I don't think this stupid loss of life is going to slow this thing down at all. If anything, it's going to grease the skids to let the war machine roll on. So I wish I could believe that. It's like, wow, I've never even heard of this country. We just had 4 people die there. But no, that's not good. I don't think that'll be the public reaction, sadly, because the media helps shape the public reaction, and the media ultimately are participants in the empire. They don't oppose it. And the editorial pages of the Washington Post and the New York Times, they promote it.
Oh, for sure. I mean, I'm not too familiar with the structure of monarchy and the norms, but I mean, they're the courtiers or something. I mean, they're definitely
commissars would be maybe closer. Apparatchiks.
Yeah. But it's also interesting how this event has brought the whole AFRICOM and the operations in Africa out into the open. And the thing that McKinney brought up is that Obama had to hide the expansion into Africa because he took a really big political hit from the Pan-African activists and the black electorate. And he really couldn't risk it being widely known just how we ended up with 3,500 military operations and troops in literally every single. I mean, I think the number of countries in Africa is, because there are some disputes, it's hard to count the actual number, but I think it's kind of consensus that they're either 53 or 54. And Dunford said we're in 53. We are in 53 African countries, he said. He said 800 is the most we have in any African country, which is kind of convenient. I don't know if I believe that or not. But when people were like, 800 troops, he was like, well, we don't have any more than that in any. This is the biggest deployment that we have. But overall, there are 6,000 U.S. troops in Africa. And I mean, God only knows how many CIA and their contractors.
Yeah, I mean, that's not even, look at like Blackwater type, what they're called, PMCs, private military companies. They're all over Africa. They've been all over Africa since the French Foreign Legion, which I mentioned previously. When they would, these mercenaries, these soldiers of fortune have been running through Africa for decades. And, they were hired by different groups. They're, and one time, I believe, in the island of Comoros, which is near Madagascar, one of the mercenary groups actually took control of the whole country. Like, this has been, like, these private military contractors, these private military companies have been running around Africa for decades during the Cold War and immediately after. And now you've got U.S. Special Forces who were running around previously back in the 90s. Remember, it was Delta Force and Army Rangers who were assaulted in Mogadishu when Bill Clinton was president. So we've been having military operations, and we've had the same, we're just here to help the people. We're a benign influence. We're trying to help Africans come up with, what was the latest line? African solutions. I mean, this is just what they want to expand it to. And now they've finally gotten their own theater. See, that was before there was no AFRICOM. Now there's a whole bureaucracy layered on top of this crap. And there's people told, like this Marine general, I'm responsible for this continent. Just like there's generals and admirals and other things responsible for. I'm responsible for Asia or this part of Asia or South America. General Kelly was previously the commander of Southern Command of South America, which meant he also oversaw Gitmo, by the way. He also oversaw Colombia operations. So now there is a commander in charge of anything that happens in Africa. The U.S. has to get involved. This is our theater of operations. And I'm telling you, that is just start that bureaucratic momentum. You'll never get out. It'll be like Afghanistan. There's just mindless expansion and budget. And there's no even pretext. At least Afghanistan had a pretext. It was 9/11. I don't know what the fuck the pretext is for AFRICOM.
I think also, and I'm not sure how well I can speak to this, but I know that Europe is a big factor here, Europe and the EU. And we're in a precarious spot with the EU right now. Trump and whoever's running his foreign policy, determined to, antagonize Iran or worse. And, Europe's not happy about that, particularly Germany, the strongest country in the EU, Germany. I mean, they also have a flourishing business relationship with China. And I think that's where they see most of their potential growth happening. So there's a major conflict. And then you have, France and the UK, who I guess are dependent on resources, and the banks are benefiting from this as well. I mean, but we have this situation where our relationship with the EU is just like, it's so fragile, it could crack. So we kind of can't afford to not help France and the UK too. So, but it's definitely.
Yeah, but you don't have to let them have him. I mean, I just don't. I think Europe is finished in 10 years. I mean, I think their power is flowing east, which is what's scaring the hell out of the DC establishment. China is going to be, this is, I don't know if I'm going to say it's a Chinese century or something like that. That's kind of a simplistic way of looking at it. But Asia is on the rise. Europe is kind of, Rumsfeld had that famous irritating claim. He said, this is old Europe and this is new Europe. But really all of Europe is old Europe. And I don't think they have, I think the idea that we would have to do this to kowtow to them or to keep them within the Western alliance, I think is all nonsense. And I think the Russian interference thing is a pretext. It's an attempt to keep what is ultimately going to come apart from coming apart quickly, which is, there's no reason for us to be involved in Europe that much. There's not really. There's no reason for NATO. Not really. There's nothing to justify this old architecture. So we have to keep, hitting the fear button, the Russians are doing it. But the reality is we just don't have, and these European powers aren't real powers anymore. I mean, all their, like France and Britain, these guys, they've been out of the empire business for like over 50 years since, right? So why are we even placating them? They're not important. So I think it's just, I agree, there is some kind of like path dependence here. So I just wonder if the wisdom of that, deferring to Europe, like who cares? The power is going to Asia, India and China, and probably Russia will play some role, are going to be major powers. And I think to sort of get in China's face and Africa to placate old colonial European powers is one of the dumbest ideas we could possibly do. Although it's not a dumb idea if you want endless war.
I agree with that, but I'm just trying to, present the point of view of the people who dominate our foreign policy, who, as you know, in my view, are just delusional, first off, dangerous, reckless, and completely unwilling to let go of the post-World War II liberal world order, or whatever they call it. They come right out. We just listened to McCain's speeches over the past couple of years about what needs to be
Yeah, does he even write them?
No.
It sounds like the Atlantic Council wrote the actual speech. I mean, it's or Strobe Talbot or one of these Brookings institutions.
Oh, right. Yeah, I mean, they use the similar language. I mean, it's like a cult almost.
It's totally a cult.
But NATO, what happens to NATO if the U.S.-European relationship falls apart or becomes less important? And it's just amazing that there's that much, there are that many people. I guess I'll never stop being shocked at how much influence and how much power the people who make our foreign policy have. I mean, I just find it astounding.
But their power
isn't worried about what they will do to try to keep that order in place.
Well, they're doing it, right? I mean, they've done the insurgents within the White House who did so much to undermine Trump. I mean, that's who they're with. That's who's doing this. That's who undermined Trump from the beginning. That's who targeted Flynn. That's who did all this damage. Whatever you think about Trump, and I think he has been actively undermined by these people. And the problem is it's going to take a sort of movement to displace the neoconservatives and the imperialists, and to be quite frank about it, the business interests. I mean, that's who's funding these think tanks that engage in these political operations. That's who's funding them. It is Boeing, it is Lockheed, it's Raytheon, it's these other people. They are funding think tanks like the Institute for the Study of War, like the Heritage Foundation, like the American Enterprise Institute. They're funding these people knowing that they are out there or of a similar opinion. I'm not saying that, give Bill Kristol or Bob Kagan or these people or Strobe Talbot aren't sincere. They might be sincere, but why are they elevated? They're elevated because they say a narrative that's particularly lucrative to people whose business is war. And so it's, even if some of these people go down, even if Max Boot makes an idiot of himself on a news program, that doesn't stop the engine of cash flooding into these places who are essentially become lobbyists, de facto lobbyists for the armaments industry. And of course, they also have real lobbyists for the armaments industry. So that's the driving force. And so, you have that's harder to dislodge. So, maybe people think Bill Kristol's not as serious. Or maybe people think David Frum is a vapid douchebag, because he is. But okay, well, they'll find somebody else. There's a million of these people who come up to Washington and say American exceptionalism.
There's a lot of money being thrown around and a lot of people who need money, and almost anyone can be bought. But, I don't see this. The other thing is, how much longer can this war on terror justification hold out? I see it weakening, seriously. And I don't see that they have any new narrative. Dunford didn't talk about officially what authority was used, which AUMF.
Nobody asked him.
Well, they're very careful to say that these troops in Niger, they are not going out on missions with the troops that they are aiding and assisting, training and assisting.
They're just advisors, Joanne. They're just advisors. They're just
Right.
helping
And
the
then
South Vietnamese army get rid of the Viet Cong. They're not going to engage in combat.
And they kept repeating about how,
Of course they do.
If an assessment is done, and on every mission, if it is assessed that it's likely to be contact with the enemy, then the U.S. troops don't accompany them. They stay. The same things they said about Syria and Iraq, where
how's that working out?
they're just beyond. I forget what the military terminology is.
Yeah, how's that working out?
Yeah, but then he goes on. He says,
They said that in Syria. Remember that Navy SEAL got killed? Oh, they don't go out on combat missions. They're just advisory. Oh, but they got in a firefight with ISIS.
But
it's a dangerous area.
But the interesting thing is that with Dunford, it's like, on one side, he's got people saying, like, why are there any limitations on our troops? They should be able to blow up anything they want, And then you have the people on the legal side saying, hey, what legal authority do you have for this? And blah, blah, blah. So he walks a balance beam here. He says, well, he goes through this whole thing about how the U.S. troops do not engage, they do not participate if contact with the enemy is expected. And it apparently wasn't expected in this mission.
Oh, you mean an ambush wasn't expected? They didn't expect an ambush?
But then he makes very clear, he says, but in this case, it was self-defense. And when self-defense is involved, there are no limitations. He said, we have that inherent right. And
yes, I broke into your house, but when I shot you, I was doing it in self-defense.
And then he also clarifies. He says, and also, if there is a threat to the U.S. involved, if they have intelligence or one of these terrorists have plans, well, then they just clear the table. They can do anything they want, because there were a lot of details issued about how the French Mirage jets came, and they, as Dunford said, they saved our bacon, but they didn't drop any bombs, which makes a lot of sense. You don't want to drop bombs that are going to hit your own.
I don't. First off, let's be very clear about something. This is what this general said at a press conference. He is almost certainly lying, straight up, and there is no penalty for lying to reporters. Now, if he's sworn under oath before a Senate committee and says that story, then at least it's worth taking seriously, because yes, he's still lying, but he's lying in a way to hopefully not catch himself. So whatever Dunford said, it is almost certainly a lie. Oh, this is how it went down. This is how. Who says who? Who can confirm this? Can anybody? Is any journalist, American journalist or independent group, in a position to confirm or deny his claim? No, which means he can say whatever he wants, and no one can say differently. No one can.
Well,
so I wouldn't take his word for anything.
Our other choices are like pundits or politicians, who I trust less than I trust the generals. I tend to go to the transcripts for the generals are generally not. The generals tend to be less slick when it comes to, I don't know, they're pretty good.
No, they're actually more slick. They're so slick they can appear to not be slick. The Pentagon is one of the best public relations outfits in world history. Like what they do to make the Marines seem romantic, like they are incredible. How they work with Hollywood to make things go their way. This idea that they are not slick. I mean, he's just tells us straight. Yeah, that's their game, and they're so fucking good at it. You can't even tell. So like when this guy's up here saying, "Oh, they weren't," when we don't go out on offensive missions, then what the fuck are you doing there? You're special forces. What are you doing there? Oh, we're just advising. That's a phone call. Why do you have to be there? Oh, we have to give them on the ground training. Oh, I don't believe it.
Yeah, that's clearly spin and pre-agreed upon and all that. But in terms of the details of things that happened, I'm still pretty good with the press conferences of particularly the ones whatever it was called, the anti-ISIS coalition. Not all of it, but in general, you can still get some credible details.
No, it's good to know what they're saying. But it's also important to remember that they're almost certainly lying. The best case study on this has to be Pat Tillman. I mean, they had 20 different stories. So that's my only caution there. Okay, this is what the general said happened. Who the hell knows what really happened? And you have to wonder, a government official is going to give you the most best story that paints them in the best light, and they're certainly going to do it when there's no one who can contradict them. How would a reporter in that room even figure out? They don't have sources on the ground in Niger. They have no ability to independently authenticate anything.
Well,
So
here's an interesting thing, though. Today, and I didn't read the whole thing, I just saw it a little while ago, a couple hours ago, there's already a leak. Supposedly, assuming I can believe this, ABC has 2 anonymous sources, one of them being one of the survivors of that raid, another one being a senior intelligence official.
Oh, boy.
And, there's tension right now.
Well, regardless of the many lies of the Pentagon or what we're doing in Africa, for real or not doing, we'll have to leave that for another time. So this is some of the discussion I think we should be having about Niger and our role. And hopefully we'll have some people on to talk about the role of AFRICOM in its expanded role and how it operates and what kind of reporting actually can be done that we can learn that isn't spoon-fed to us at press conferences by Pentagon officials. So with that, thank you, Joanne. I'll thank myself.
Thank you, Dan. Also, we should apologize to our viewers for the delay. We had some unexpected equipment failures and technical difficulties, and we'll make up for that. There'll be extra episodes to catch up on that.
More and more. There's no shortage of news, and there's no shortage of imperial blundering.
Definitely needs more attention, and in my research just for doing this in the past couple of days, I found a couple of sources with a point of view you're not just not going to get from any U.S. official or any U.S. official mainstream media.
Well, that's for sure.
That's what we try to do with this podcast. We try to, be reality-based. we try to get, and we're particularly fond of reality-based, insightful points of view that you can't get from. And it's just getting worse and worse.
Okay. All right. So on that happy note, that's our show. Please check out AroundTheEmpire.com. Check out @AroundTheEmpire on Twitter. Follow Joanne Leone on Twitter, also at US Empire Show. That's me on Twitter. And we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Take care, everyone.